Hey folks, huge shout out to Kindergartner as always. He just dropped a Q&A video on his channel answering a lot of questions about the Kittenverse. Make sure to go check it out and show your support. Back in 2008, I ran a crew of small-time bank robbers that used to hit privately owned banks in small towns. You've probably never heard of us, mainly because no one in any of the law enforcement agencies ever caught on to what we were doing. I'd always thought it was because we only hit banks in small towns that no one cares enough about to look into. But I was wrong. My crew consisted of 4 people. There was Frankie. He was our general safecracker. I say that very loosely. The man was a former EOD specialist with the army and had come home from Iraq the previous year. There wasn't much he couldn't unlock with the appropriate amount of explosives applied in the right area. Then there was Thomas. He too was ex-military, being a former Marine infantryman. He was our weapons guy. Anything we needed, he could get us. We usually didn't go into banks guns blazing. We liked to hit them after hours. Less people get hurt. Less people to get caught in a crossfire. Then there was our getaway driver, Sadie. I'd recruited her myself after I'd seen her evade the police after getting busted drag racing. Girl was one of the best, if not the best, drivers that I'd ever seen. Last but not least, there was me. I wouldn't call myself the brains of the operation, but I was the leader of the group. I brought all of us together. Thomas was a childhood friend. I'd met Frankie in the army, and like I said, I recruited Sadie. The robbery before our last had gotten a little dicey. We had robbed a small bank that was run by some no-name company called Gideon. But 3 of the 6 we'd hit so far were as well. We'd done the typical after-hours break-in. We'd scoped out where the vault was during the open hours. Then at night, we blew through the wall closest to the vault with some breaching charges. Then blew through the vault itself. We weren't sneaky or stealthy. We hit loud, hard and fast, then left. Only the local police found us as we were hauling ass with the bag back out into the parking lot. The cop who got out was young, couldn't have been older than 21. Stepped out from the squad car, screaming at us to stop with his gun raised. Thomas didn't hesitate. He'd armed us all with M9s. He opened fire on the cop, and while none of the bullets were lethal, he hit the kid in the arm and Kevlar plate. But I didn't know that at the time. We shot into the back of Sadie's black Dodge Charger, and I ripped my ski mask off and looked at him. Frankie got into the front. "What the fuck was that?" I practically yelled at him. "He was gonna shoot us," Thomas argued. "He was a cop. If he's dead, then this whole thing dies with him," I shouted back. Thomas groaned as he rolled his eyes. The tires of Sadie's Hellcat squealed on the pavement as we rocketed out of the parking lot. I could feel my heart shuddering as we left the parking lot. Sadie had put fake license plates on it, so we didn't have to worry about being tracked that way. We were out of town before the police officers recovered enough to call for backup. We had gotten lucky. He was new and inexperienced. He didn't call us in when he found us at the bank. By the time the police were out in force looking for a Dodge Charger, we were across state lines. 2 months later, we were planning our next job. Another Gideon bank. This one, 2 states away. We'd planned this one carefully. Thomas and I had gone in during the day and scoped it out. This was supposed to be our big one. Our last one. This Gideon bank was bigger than all the others we'd hit. The building was an older looking 2-story brick building. It was also the only building in its parking lot, and one of 7 buildings in the town we were in. I'm not gonna say where for safety reasons. I don't want any of you guys going there. It didn't look dilapidated or anything. It just looked like it had been built in the 80s. As we walked up, we realized that the building was only old on the outside. The front doors were made of glass and they slid open. A cool wave of air hit us in the face. Inside, we were met by a pristine black and white marble floor that led to the main desk, which sat in front of a large black vault. The front desk seemed to stretch the length of the building and was topped with a plexiglass window that went to the ceiling. I managed to spot 6 security cameras in total. There wasn't an inch of the building that wasn't being recorded. It wouldn't matter. We had masks for that. Thomas's eyes, however, never left the vault. It was easily the biggest we'd ever hit. The last few had been no bigger than a large closet. This one looked about the size of a master bedroom. The vault's shiny black door had been open. It had to have been 3 feet thick. The walls on the sides were lined with security boxes. Then, in the very back of the vault, there was another even smaller doorway, one we both knew led to Major Mark. I also noticed that there was barely anyone working inside. Just a tall blonde woman with thick glasses who seemed to be struggling against the crowd of customers that were lined up inside. Jesus Christ, that's a big safe, I heard Thomas mutter. 2 hours later, we were back at our hotel making plans. We decided to keep to what worked. Sadie would park outside the bank while we blew open one of the side walls, and then the vault doorway. We'd get the money, then get out. It wouldn't take us more than 3 minutes tops. The average police response in the area was 5. We'd figured that out by listening in on their radio channel in the days leading up. It was around 2 in the morning when we pulled up. Sadie took a deep drag of her cigarette before putting it out into the ashtray. She brushed her inky black hair behind her ear as she turned to Frankie and I. Thomas sat loading a semi-automatic 12-gauge next to her. We're here. Now, let's get this over with. Frankie and I stepped out. You sure you can do this? I asked as he placed the breaching charge onto the brick wall. If I wasn't, I wouldn't be here. We took cover behind the car, and he detonated the charger. The explosion imploded the brick wall. The alarm blared in our ears. Thomas, Frankie and I took off running into the massive hole in the wall. 3 minutes, Frankie, I shouted. We'd found ourselves to the left of the circular vault door. There wasn't a circular lock mechanism on the outside, like on most bank vaults. It was completely smooth with a keypad on the right side. Thomas stood watch at the door with his shotgun, while Frankie went to work on the door. So, how do you want to do this? I asked. Oh, this is gonna take a second, he said as he looked up at it. My heart jumped into my throat. Can you not blow it open? I asked. Not without collapsing the building on top of us. You didn't tell me it was this big, he argued. I told you it was big. Boy, this isn't like the other vaults we've been going after. I can't just rig up a charge and blow up the lock. Fuck, I groaned. What's the problem? Asked Thomas. Frankie doesn't think he can blow it open, I replied. Frankie looked at the keypad. He raised his flashlight to it. It's a 4-digit password. Any guesses? He asked. Are you fucking serious? I asked. Try 6969, Thomas joked. Look, dude, we don't have time for this. Let's just go, I said. But Frankie was already putting a sequence of numbers in. Frankie, I was interrupted by the massive round door suddenly opening. Fuck me, that worked, Frankie laughed. Wait, did 6969 work? Thomas asked. No, I used 1234, Frankie replied with a laugh. I was honestly at a loss for words. Frankie pulled the vault the rest of the way open. We've got less than a minute, I said as I looked at my watch. We quickly made our way into the vault. It was pitch black aside from our flashlights. Frankie started opening the safety deposit boxes while Thomas and I walked through the back doorway. I still don't remember exactly what we expected to find. Money? Valuables maybe? But not a fucking candlelit shrine. The white waxy candles illuminated a small marble statue of a woman with ropes and a bow in one hand and a quiver full of arrows on her back. The hell? Thomas said. That was when we heard the scream. The blood-curdling, horrible scream. We came out of the back room just as Sadie came sprinting into the vault. She was incoherently babbling. She practically fell into Thomas's arms. Thomas looked at me, then Frankie. What happened? Why aren't you with the car? Frankie asked. She flipped it, Sadie practically stammered out. "What?" Frankie and I asked simultaneously. That was when the floor dropped out beneath us. I was sent careening down what felt like a massive slide in pitch-black darkness. I could hear the screams of my crew as we fell for what seemed like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. We finally came to a stop when we hit some damp dirt. The place I'd found myself was brightly illuminated. I looked around. My heart was drumming in my chest. We were in what looked like a forest. A massive forest. Thomas was helping Sadie up behind me. What just happened?" asked Frankie as he stood up next to me. I looked at the fresh greenery around me. The forest was thick and full of noises. My eyes shot to the sky. That's when I realized that we weren't outside. The massive lights hanging almost 500 feet above us on the ceiling made sure of that. "Where are we?" I asked. "We're definitely not in the bank anymore," Thomas said. "No shit," Frankie said. I turned to the slide that we just came falling from. The dark tunnel had exited from the mouth of a statue of a bearded man on the wall. I took a step towards it when the stone mouth shut. I stopped dead in my tracks. Sadie sobbed. Thomas raised his 12 gauge. "Sadie? Honey? What happened up top?" Thomas asked. Sadie sobbed again. Thomas grabbed her and shook her. "Sadie? Thomas?" I barked. Sadie seemed to get herself together. "The cops showed up. Then, some woman with a bow and arrow killed them all. I tried to drive away, but she caught the car." Thomas and I looked at each other as we remembered the shrine. "She caught the car?" Thomas asked. "Yes, she caught the fucking car, grabbed it by the front bumper, and lifted it off the ground. I got out and ran back to you guys." "Wait, you were just gonna leave us?" Frankie demanded. "Frankie, stop!" I shouted. "We can worry about that later. Right now, we need to get out of here, wherever here is." "This is an underground game preserve." A female sounded off, a voice that sounded like it was coming from all around us. I pulled my M9. Thomas raised his weapon. "Where are you?" I demanded. "Who are you?" asked Thomas. "Artemis, goddess of the hunt herself. At least, that's what they used to call me," the woman claimed. My heart danced a little in my chest. A chill ran up my spine. I wasn't sure why, but I was terrified. "Why are we here?" I asked, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer. "That's a good question, Mr. Watts. Why are you here? 6 bank robberies in 8 months. That's impressive. You seem quite skilled in eluding the authorities. But did you ever take a moment to wonder why none of the bigger name agencies ever caught on to you? Especially after you slipped up and shot that police officer?" The voice asked. I was afraid to ask. "You don't know who owns the bank you've been robbing, do you? Gideon isn't fond on letting the police get involved in their business, even if they're victims of a crime. Which is why we're going to play a little game. Tell you what, you win, you can keep the bag of diamonds you stole from the deposit boxes. All you have to do is make it to the exit door." I turned and looked at Frankie, who held up a small sack and then shoved it into his duffel bag. "And if we lose?" Thomas asked. "I'm the goddess of the hunt. Do I really need to answer that question?" "Where is the exit?" asked Thomas. "The other side of the labyrinth." The crew all looked at each other. We didn't say a word. We just gathered our shit and moved. The forest was thick and a massive pain in the ass to get through. We pushed through it for an hour before we came to a clearing. We found ourselves walking across a field of knee-high grass. The air was humid, and we were all sweating bullets. We'd all come to our senses a bit more though. I didn't know much about Greek mythology at the time, but I did know that this couldn't be happening. We had to be part of some kind of con. "Wait," I said, stopping. Everyone stopped. All eyes were on me. "You realize how this sounds, right?" I asked. "Does it matter? "Let's fucking go," Thomas replied. I turned to him. That was when I noticed a glint coming from the woods behind us. I shouldn't have stopped the group. But, be honest, would you believe what was going on yourself? The arrow flew faster than anything I'd ever seen. It erupted from Thomas's eyeball. He stood there for a second. His shotgun plopped to the field below me. Then, his body hit the ground with a thud. "Thomas?" I mumbled, just before Frankie tackled me to the ground. "Shit, where'd that arrow come from?" he shouted in my ear. It took me a second to regain my senses. I grabbed Thomas's 12-gauge. "Tree line, just behind us," I said. The three of us who were left were on our bellies in the tall grass, all afraid to lift our heads because we might get domed by an arrow. We stayed there for 10 to 15 minutes in silence. I was afraid to move. Frankie took initiative here. "What? Dude, we gotta move," he said. I took a deep breath to steady my shaking hands while he reached into his backpack. I watched him as he rigged the remaining breaching charge underneath Thomas's body. "What are you doing?" I asked. "She's the goddess of the hunt, right? Hunters take trophies. Now, on 3, we're gonna take off towards the next tree line. I want you to unload that shotgun in the direction of wherever that arrow came from," Frankie said sternly. I nodded, then looked at Sadie, who nodded as well. "Okay, 1, 2, 3. I shot to my feet and unloaded the shotgun. It made my ears ring loudly as it bucked in my hands. After it clicked, I threw it down and took off after Frankie and Sadie. We made it into the next tree line in a few seconds. This one was thinner, but there were a lot more trees and a lot less brush. It didn't go on for very long, but we didn't slow down for long enough for me to really stop and look. We came out the other side of this tree line when we heard the breaching charge explode in the distance. Frankie came to a screeching stop ahead of me. "You think we got her?" I asked. "I don't know," he replied. We'd found ourselves at the entrance of what looked like a small ancient city. There were stone buildings lined up in neat rows on either side of a narrow road that led up to a larger temple-looking building. A statue, just like the one we'd seen in the bank, sat at the end. This one was about maybe 40 feet high. "Who do you think lives around here?" Sadie asked. "I don't know, but I'd rather not." Frankie's words were interrupted by a loud, guttural growl, one that came from right behind us. I instinctively turned with my pistol raised, as did Frankie. Where 3 massive black dogs stood. The one in the front was baring its teeth at me. What kind of dogs they were? I don't know. They looked like Rottweilers, but they were the size of horses. Sadie shrank behind me as Frankie and I raised our pistols. The lead dog didn't flinch. It only growled as it stepped forward. "Hunting dogs?" I asked Frankie as we started to slowly back up. "I don't fucking know," he replied. That was when the lead dog lurched forward. The grip on my pistol tightened as I fired off 5 to 6 rounds. Frankie did the same. The dog fell to the ground in a pool of its own blood. The other 2 suddenly darted back into the forest. "Shit, we gotta go," Frankie said. "Why?" "I think she was using them to give her some time to catch." An arrow zipped out of the tree line and sank itself into Frankie's stomach. He cried out in pain as he was knocked off his feet and onto the ground. I turned back to the forest, where I could see a tall blonde woman in white robes pulling another arrow from her quiver and knocking it onto her bowstring. That's when I realized it. It was the same blonde woman from the bank earlier. I raised my pistol and emptied the rest of my magazine into her direction. But either the bullets missed or they bounced off of her. She smirked at me as she aimed her bow. "Run!" I shouted as I turned to Sadie. Barely had the word escape my mouth before an arrow had whisked over my shoulder and hit the poor girl right between her eyes. Sadie fell. I turned back to Frankie, who was looking at the golden arrow protruding from his stomach. I wanted to help him. I wanted to pick him up and carry him away. But I knew that it was a fool's errand. At least, that's what I tell myself. I didn't say a word. I just turned and ran. I ran as hard and as fast as I could. I was out of weapons and ideas. I wasn't sure what happened to Frankie. At least, not yet. I know after I got past the temple, I'd ended up in another forest, where I ran for what felt like hours. I ran so hard, my feet hurt. I eventually found myself by a stream where I dropped to my knees. I think I may have spent an hour sobbing. I was alone. My friends were all dead. I had no idea if I was even headed towards an exit. I also didn't even have the diamonds that Frankie had stolen anymore. They had seemingly lost their importance with everything that had happened. I thought about drowning myself in the stream, maybe finding a sharp rock or something. I know, coward's way out. But at least, it would have been on my terms. My thoughts were interrupted by movement behind me. I froze solid. I was sure that I was gonna die at that moment. She'd caught up to me, and I was gonna get an arrow to the back. Or maybe I'd get lucky and get one to the back of my skull. But the arrow never came. Instead, a giant buck wandered out of the tree line. It walked right up next to me and took a few sips from the stream. I chuckled under my breath when I looked at it. The buck was massive. When I stood up next to it, my head only reached its shoulder. "What are you doing all the way down here?" I asked. The buck, of course, didn't respond. It took a few drinks and wandered off. I looked down at the stream. I put my hand in it. The water was cold. It was ungodly. It was also ungodly clear. I took a handful and took a few sips. It tasted like sink water. That was when I heard Frankie's scream from ahead of me. My eyes grew large. I shot to my feet. Had he somehow gotten away? I took off towards the screams, running through even more forest and thick brush. I should have honestly known that it was a trap. But you've got to understand, I was exhausted. And I was at the point to where I knew that the chances of me living were slim to non-fucking existent. I found Frankie strung up by his ankles from a tree, an arrow still protruding from his stomach. Oh God. I practically sobbed to myself. The stench was awful. I stepped closer to him. Frankie? I cried. Frankie, say something. But the man was already gone. That was when I noticed that a small bag of diamonds, along with his pistol, had been left under him. I reached down and grabbed the pistol. I ejected the magazine to see how many rounds it had left. It had one of those magazines with small numbered holes in the back, so you could know when it was full. There were 8 bullets left inside. I exhaled as I put the pistol in my waistband. I knelt down by the back. My face was a few inches from Frankie's. I tried to avoid looking into his dead eyes. I opened the bag to find that the diamonds were still there. Frankie had taken a lot. I wasn't exactly sure how many, but by the looks of it, there were probably enough to set me up for life. But that was the thing. I lifted the bag and was about to throw it over my shoulder when I heard a twig snap from my right. Then movement from my left. I turned to see one of the hunting dogs was standing maybe 7 feet from me. I raised my pistol. It stayed put, its eyes not leaving the weapon for a second. I turned the other way, where the second dog was silently watching me as well. I aimed at it as I started backing away. The dog replied with a low growl. I walked backwards, keeping the dogs in my field of vision. That was when I noticed her drop down from the very tree she'd strung up Frankie from. I aimed Frankie's pistol at her. The dogs both snarled at me, but she shut them up with a wave of her hand. She was way taller up close. The woman must have stood at least 6'4". Her skin was flawless, her eyes a dark shade of grey. The look in her eyes seemed almost playful. She smiled at me almost pitifully as I aimed my weapon at her. "Stay the hell away from me," I barked. She didn't have her bow. Instead, she had a dagger in one hand. You wouldn't think bringing a knife to a gunfight would work out. But truthfully, it only made her scarier. "I don't know who the fuck you think you are. You're not a goddess though, and if you come any closer, I'll put a bullet in your skull," I shouted. She looked at me, then the gun. Then her smile grew wider as she took a mocking step forward. I squeezed the trigger of Frankie's pistol. The gun went off. Now, I know I didn't miss. I know because there was a bullet-sized hole in the rope right above her heart. But no blood came out. It was almost as if the bullet had bounced off. My face contorted in fear and frustration as I fired again, then again. She seemed to take pleasure in it too, as she only walked closer and closer to me. Before I could unload on her though, her hand was around my throat, and my feet were off the ground. Her face was now wearing a wicked smile. I leveled my pistol with her face and fired again. The bullets were useless. I might as well have been using a fucking Nerf gun. "Do it, you fucking bitch," I said defiantly as she raised the knife. She stopped for a second. Her head tilted to one side as the smile left her face. She looked kind of confused. "What did you just call me?" she demanded. "You hurt me," I grunted as I struggled against her iron grip. I could feel her grip tighten as my windpipe was almost squeezed shut. I struggled hard as I used the pistol to try and smack her in the face. The metal barrel made contact again and again, but it was like I was hitting a rock. Her look of confusion morphed into another grin. "You're a feisty one, aren't you?" she asked. I was out of options. I had maybe 3 bullets left and was considering using the last one on myself as a massive fuck you to her. Then I realized I hadn't let go of the diamonds. I swung the back hard, clocking the woman in the skull. This actually did something. I felt her grip loosen. The next thing I knew, I was on the 4th floor. I didn't waste any time getting to my feet and running as fast as I could. I could hear the dogs taking off after me. I knew I didn't have much time. I wasn't sure how close they were to me, so I kept pushing harder. The harder I ran, the thicker the brush around me seemed to get. I was struggling to move forward. I kept falling. I'm sure I face-planted more than once. The thorn bushes stabbed and cut into me. It hurt, but I didn't care. Then suddenly, I came out the other side, right in front of a massive stone wall, right in front of an open doorway that led into a black abyss. I practically dropped to my knees. I'd made it to the other side of the dome. The doorway led me through a tunnel. I was in the dark, walking for hours, before I exited out the base of a small hill in the middle of nowhere, where I found Sadie's black Charger waiting for me. It was a bit beat up now. The front bumper was missing. I walked up to it and tossed it back into the passenger seat before finding a note with my name on it, taped to the steering wheel. It said, "Congratulations, you escaped the labyrinth. You can keep the diamonds. Think of it as compensation for your friends' untimely demise." I think I sobbed for 3 to 4 more hours before I finally worked up the nerve to leave. Since then, I've stayed away from banks or anything owned by Gideon. I never sold the diamonds. Instead, they're at the bottom of a lake somewhere close to where I live. I've tried therapy, but whenever I tell the psychiatrist I was hunted by a Greek goddess for sport, they just sit there and laugh at me. They think I'm fucking delusional. For a while, I started believing them. Hell, I even spent some time in the nut house. Eventually, I considered that I'd maybe imagined the whole thing. At least, until last night. There was a knock on my door. When I answered it, there was this tall, ginger dude in a fancy suit with a black eye patch over his left eye. "My name is Agent Loxley. I heard you used to rob banks